Good afternoon, actually. Not really understanding Spanish too well. I have no idea what was just said about me. I cannot vouch for its accuracy, but hopefully it will all work out. When I was first told it was a reunion, an alumni reunion, I don't know why I thought it was going to be like 20 people sitting around a fireplace or something, having a few beers. You're a very large audience, so I'm glad to see that you've all graduated. That's a very good thing. Before we go too far, I talk about the power of simplicity, how it relates to Apple. The first thing people have been asking me about these days is, like, what is going on in the U.S.? So I start with this. Someone sent me this morning. It kind of sums up how I feel. I just thought I would share it with you. If you can read that. Oh, sweet Jesus, please, God, no. Basically, everyone in the U.S. that I know feels that way today. How did that happen? We have no idea, but we'll see how it all works out in the next 4 years. Hopefully, the U.S. won't destroy the world and we'll be all okay. But anyway, a little background on me, just to get you, so you understand where I'm coming from, is that I worked with Steve Jobs. I was his ad agency creative director for 4 years when he came back to Apple in 1997. And we did the Think Different campaign. We introduced the iMac and iBook and all kinds of things like that. And that was a good thing. But I worked with Steve for 8 years on Next, which was a company you may know that he started when he was forced out of Apple. So basically, I had 12 years working with Steve pretty closely. And you've heard what a tough guy Steve can be, and I am here to confirm that story. He could be rather brutal. So I proudly proclaim that in my 12 years working with Steve, that he only beat me up 2 times. And I'm very proud of that. And it gets even more impressive if you annualize that number, right? Very few beatings per year. So I worked closely with Steve, and I lived to tell the tale. And I think basically the stories you hear about him are very true. He could be that tough, but he had a side that a lot of people don't know about. He was charismatic, visionary, and funny. He had a great sense of humor. So working with him on all these different projects, we had an exciting time, fun time, and sometimes not so fun time. But in the end, it all worked out pretty darn well. I worked with these other companies also, Dell and Intel in particular, that actually were my inspiration to write the book about the power of simplicity because they were anything but simple. We probably worked 3 times as hard, 3 times as long, spent more money, and we ended up with a less effective marketing campaign. So it struck me, why are we working this way? Why doesn't everyone work the way Apple works? I think people would achieve far better results. So I had the bright idea to write a book about it called Insanely Simple. And before we get going any further, I have my warm-up exercise. This whole thing has been a warm-up exercise. So you have to give me a little while to get into it. I came bearing a gift today to give to the lucky winner of my surprise quiz here. It's my book, actually. The first book. The new one just came out a few months ago. But I'm going to give you a little multiple choice test, and the person who wins it gets the book. And the reason I do things like this is because there's always like a little behind-the-scenes story that you might find interesting. Hopefully you do. And you can use some of this trivia that I give you to impress friends when you're drinking in a bar one night or something. So the question is, this is your interactive question, that when Apple was introducing the first iPhone, we actually couldn't use the name iPhone because Cisco had a product called the iPhone. There was all this behind-the-scenes negotiating going on. And we didn't know where it was going to end up, so we had to have all these extra names ready just in case we couldn't use the name iPhone. So I'm going to put 5 names up here. 4 of them were actually names we considered. The iPhone could have been called any of these 4 names. The 5th one I just made up for the benefit of this quiz. If you can identify the name we wouldn't have gone with. Boy, this is a complicated thing for a presentation about simplicity, but it will all become clear. Your job is to find the name we didn't consider out of these 5 names. The first name was Moby, which was short for mobile. Not a whole lot shorter, but every character counts, you know. The second name was iTalk, coming after the iPod. The phone was coming, and who knows, it was going to be another I thing, so perhaps the pod was the music thing, and talk would be the phone. Tripod, because it was 3 things in one coming after the iPod. It was a phone, it was an internet device, and it was a music player. Or telepod, because it was 2 things in one. It was the merger of the iPod and the phone, could have been. And then last, is it possible? Last, is it possible that 3 years before the introduction of the iPad was actually a name we came up with for the iPhone? Who knows? Stranger things have happened. So I give you 1 moment to think of your answer. Which of these names was not considered? Okay. By raise of hand, we must maintain decorum here. I think I saw a hand go up somewhere that was, no? You were just fixing your hair. Would you like to guess? It's like being at an auction. You do this and I say, $100. No? Just pick a number, 1 to 5. No? Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you. Say what? Number 3? I love it. Actually, I don't love it. Oh, no, 3. You're wrong, by the way. So I'm sorry. Tripod kind of would have been an interesting name. Oh, I'm sorry, we'll go over here for a moment. Mr. You in the green shirt. Number 1. We have another loser. That was a name we considered as well. I'm sorry. And then, let's see, do we have a woman right here in the gray sweater? 4. Okay, now that's the one. I hate it when people guess because you lose also. But but that was my suggestion. I loved that name. How dare you think it was a bad name? But anyway, so now I promise this won't go more than 5 rounds, right? You've only got 2 choices left. The 2 fingers up there. Are you guessing number 2? Oh, you're right. You win. iTalk was not a name that we came up with for iPhone. But the whole idea of this particular quiz was that iPad really was a name we came up with for the iPhone 3 years before the iPhone appeared. 3 years before the iPad appeared. So I'm not sure, who were you again? I'm losing track, but when we're done, you can pick it up right here. Congratulations. Okay. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, is there a presentation in this show at some point? And the answer is yes, it starts now. And I start with the shocker, basically, that there is no... I'm sorry. There we go. That there is no such thing as simplicity. And I say that because every simple thing you see in this world is the result of a lot of hard work. Whether it's a product, a website, an internal organization in a company, you know, there's always a struggle. You know, weeks, months, years of debate, hard work, research, whatever it is, you end up with something. And the only thing that matters is whether, I'm sorry, my button isn't happening as quickly as it should. There we go. The perception of simplicity. If someone thinks they have had a simple experience, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter how much hard work you put into it, and you never get to explain that to anyone, like, please forgive us, it was a lot of hard work. Is that perception someone has? Was their experience, was their interaction with you, your product, your company, whatever, did it make them feel, oh, that was simple? And if it didn't, you lose, and if they do feel that, you win. So when Steve came back to Apple in 1997, this was that year, this was a famous cover of Wired magazine, because Apple was near death. Steve would say in later years that Apple was a mere 90 days from bankruptcy. And yet, and so Wired ran this cover. Apple was like the symbol of creativity in the world of technology, and if Apple died, creativity in a certain way would die with it. So Wired was very upset about this. But a mere 14 years later, Apple became the most valuable company on earth. So you go from near death to most valuable on earth in just 14 years. It's pretty extraordinary. Obviously, we'd never seen that before. I would assume we'll never see that again, at least in our lifetimes. It's a pretty amazing performance. And I think it is largely due to this thing called simplicity. And simplicity works because the world is complicated. And when you do something simple in a complicated world, it stands out. It's a competitive advantage. People perceive that instantly, and they react more warmly to what it is that you do, because every human being has built into their DNA the preference for simplicity. If we're given the choice of two paths to the same end, we'll always choose the simpler path. This isn't exactly brain surgery. So this is a principle upon which Steve Jobs placed much of his effort. You can see that in the products that Apple has made. Just as an example, when they came out with a remote control, it didn't look anything like the ones that we were used to in our lives. Apple has this core belief that you wouldn't distract people with things that they don't use all the time. Why would you put 30 buttons on a remote control when there's only 3 or 4 that people would use every day, and all the rest of them get used maybe once a year? So all they do is distract and make the things you want to do more difficult to do. So that's the same principle Steve applied to not only the products, the hardware design, the software design, but we applied the same rules to our advertising, Apple's retail stores, really everything Apple did. The organization of Apple itself, where Steve basically eliminated all the committees and made people a lot more responsible for their work. It was all about giving people this focus and making everything they do or their experience with the company feel that much simpler. It was creating the perception of simplicity. So along the way today, we will discuss a few principles. There are a few in these books I've written, and there are too many to go through now, but I'll just give you a few of the highlights. But one is about the idea of authenticity. Now, I'm a marketing person, so all the companies that I've interacted with really the marketing groups inside those companies, but I get a sense of what the cultures are like in those companies. And things were very, very different with Apple versus the other companies. Steve Jobs wanted a campaign at the beginning when he came back that would capture the essence of Apple. That became the Think Different campaign. And basically, he hated things that sounded like advertising. In a way, he was kind of an anti-advertising marketing person. He loved marketing, but he hated things that sounded like marketing. He wanted things to be authentic. So Think Different was very authentic to Apple. You could put those words up on the wall in the garage they worked in, Steve Jobs' father's garage, when they created their very first computer. They were thinking different then too, and you could use that phrase today if they wanted to, but they don't. People still write about Apple, though, about thinking different. It so perfectly captures their DNA. Other companies I've worked with, they'll say they want a brand campaign, like a Dell, for example. I don't want to name names, but let's have a brand campaign. And the first thing we do is spend an entire month trying to decide what we want to be when we grow up. And once we decide on that, then we can start making an ad campaign that creates that image for them. Well, we didn't do that with Apple because Apple was a very distinct company with very distinct roots. And Think Different was just a great way, and I won't say we stumbled upon it, but we worked hard to come up with that, and it just really did a good job of capturing what Apple was about. So we created this campaign called Think Different, and the first thing we did was come up with a commercial to launch it, which some of you are probably familiar with. It's called The Crazy Ones. And Steve Jobs was a great client. He didn't write the commercial as some people think he did, but he was a great, critic, or he'd offer his opinions with every version we did and participate in the process. And he really, really loved what we ended up with. So we said, when it came time to record a voice, why don't you be the voice of the commercial? And he said, no, bad idea, because then people will be debating amongst themselves why the CEO of Apple had to have such a huge ego that he would be the voice of his own commercial. So I don't want to do that, because I love these words and I want people to hear them and understand them and appreciate them, because they capture what Apple is about. Well, he did agree to do a read for us, and I went up to Apple one day with my sound guy, and we set up in the Apple auditorium, waiting for Steve, and waiting some more, and he showed up finally about 30 minutes late, and he was in one of his darker moods, so he said, I'm really busy today. I think this is a horrible idea. I'm going to give you one read, and I'm out of here. So we were like, okay, good attitude. We can work with that. So he gave us a read, and he actually did a darn good job. So I'm not sure how many of you have seen this version, but it's kind of a good mood setter, if nothing else. It never ran on television, but it was played at Apple when they had a huge memorial service in the middle of the Apple campus after Steve passed away. They played the soundtrack for this commercial, but this is Steve Jobs reading the text, or doing the voice for the Think Different commercial. This is a version that has Spanish subtitles, by the way, so perhaps that will help some of you.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
And just so you know what it was like to work with the guy, just imagine you're in that room, and he gave a very soft, beautiful read, and his words were still sort of hanging in the air, are the ones who do. And there was like that moment of silence, and then he said, that's it, it's a horrible idea, and he stormed off the stage and left the room. So go figure. But it was a beautiful read, and for the sake of posterity, I'm glad that he did that for us. But we did this, the beauty of Think Different was that it was an incredible simplifier for this campaign that we would run for the next 4 years. Basically, the rule was that Think Different had to be sort of the period at the end of every sentence. Every headline we wrote, every piece that we created had to logically end in the idea of thinking different. And if it didn't, then we couldn't run it. That was our theme, and that's what everything we did had to pay off with the idea of thinking different. By the way, I don't know if you saw the Steve Jobs movie with Ashton Kutcher, which is a couple of years old now, but the funniest part, for me anyway, was at the very end, he actually does that reading of the commercial because it was a somewhat famous moment. But in the movie, he's in this beautiful sound studio, which was not in real life, but he gives that same beautifully soft read, and then he turns to the camera and he just very quietly says, was that okay? It's like, that's not the way it happened. He was in a rough, foul mood that day, but actually I think that would have been a better thing for a movie than the one they did, but my opinion. So, second point is about the idea of choice. Now, every company on earth wants to give customers a choice. Apple certainly gives people choices. Everyone gives people choices, but the question is, how much choice is too much choice? Because when you get too much choice, you are frozen into inaction. You start wondering what the right thing to do is because you see so many choices. So Apple's been pretty good at really not making a lot of products, to be honest. In the earliest days of Apple, they used to have a good, better, best configuration on their website. But that's something everyone in the world can relate to. You know, we've all grown up with those kind of choices. It's an easy way to organize. We also are very familiar with the idea of small, medium, and large. You know, these are just some basic things that we grow up with. We all don't even have to think about them. Those are choices, but they're very simple choices. But if you're looking for a laptop today, and you go over to Dell's site, for example, you'll see 26 distinct models of laptops. They're home, business, government, and education. They're all distinct, different models. It's kind of wild. But if you go over to HP, it gets even wilder. They've got 41 distinct models of laptops, and little old Apple has only 3. So the question is, you know, is that a lack of choice or is that a lack of confusion? I would argue it's the latter. We all know that Apple's been traditionally terrible at market share. I don't think they've ever had more than 10% market share in the last 30 years. But there's this thing called profit share, the share of the total available profits in any category. And in that measure, Apple makes more than Dell and HP combined. So you could look at it and say, I guess that lack of choice isn't really hurting them. And perhaps it is that excessive choice that is getting in the way for Dell and HP, although you'll never convince them of that. I worked with Dell, and I used to ask them all the time, why? And you get a lot of different answers, but I'm not sure if you really need to have that much choice, as opposed to focusing on doing some really, really good things. And we'll get a little bit more to that in a bit. In this new book I wrote, I talked to 40, it wasn't just about Apple and Steve Jobs anymore. I talked to 40 business leaders around the world in different industries about the power of simplicity and how much they believe in it and what they've done to leverage the power of simplicity in their businesses. One of the guys I talked to, a very impressive one, was Brian Hartzer, who is the CEO of Westpac Bank in Australia, which is the second largest bank in Australia. And it's actually Australia's oldest company. It was the very, very first company that signed up with the officials to be a company. So it's kind of an interesting thing to lay claim to. But they're now the second biggest bank, and they've got dozens of offices around Australia. They've got tens of thousands of employees, and they had a ton of credit card offerings. So what Brian did was, when he became CEO, he looked at the credit card offerings, and he found it terribly confusing. And he said, look, what we're going to do is make a matrix. We've got so many different kinds. We only have a few kinds of credit cards. We have a few kinds of customers. We have frequent flyer cards and cashback cards, et cetera. We have young customers. We have retiring customers. We have business customers, and so on. So he made a matrix, and he said, we have all these boxes to fill, a different kind of card for each different kind of customer. And that's it. You get one product for every space on this grid. And they had something like 28 cards, and they reduced it to 13 or 14 or something like that. But the point is, sales went up. And Brian was like so happy that he was able to simplify in this way, because he not only made things simpler for his customers, they could identify what kind of customer they were, and they knew what kind of card they wanted, and therefore that's what I want. But for his own people, the people in the bank who were actually having to explain this thing to customers, for the first time they had clarity. They were being stumped by customers' questions. Why would I want this one more than that one? Well, suddenly they could explain and they could answer questions very easily. So it was of benefit to both the customers and the people who worked for Westpac. So one of my favorite quotes is this one: perfection is achieved not when there's nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to remove. And this is true not only in product features or in product lines, all the different laptops all those guys are offering. It's also true in a PowerPoint presentation. My colleagues and I do this all the time. It's almost a game. Who can take out the most lines and paragraphs and pages to reduce the presentation to the things that really, truly matter, and we can say them more powerfully without confusing people with distracting things that don't need to be there, like that Sony remote control. Another important thing is that simplicity is how one generates love. Love to Steve was one of the most important things that he would talk to us about frequently. Our job as advertising people was to make customers love Apple. They had to have this emotional connection. Now, the designers and engineers obviously were doing that with the products, and it was our job to do it with the advertising. But the reason why Steve wanted to really feed this emotional connection was threefold. There were three reasons. One is that if people loved Apple, they'd keep buying stuff, which is obviously a good thing. But two, they would evangelize to their friends and their family and their colleagues, because if their experience was that good, if they loved the products that much, they would sell them to other people. We all do that today. We fall in love with a product and we recruit those in our circles. Our enthusiasm bubbles over. But last, if people really had that emotional connection, then they'd stick with Apple when the inevitable bad thing happens. And Steve was very aware that bad things happen. Despite the best of planning, things do happen. And if the news becomes negative, when people feel that emotional attachment, they'll stick with you and they'll give you a break because, they're a great company, I really love them, so they made a mistake, not the end of the world. And an example of that actually happened when the iPhone 4 was introduced. You may remember that if you're an Apple fan, the Apple 4 was the first phone that had the antenna that went around the edges. And the story that broke within 24 hours of the product being released was that if you held the phone a certain way, you would short out the antenna and you'd drop your call. It was never really the problem that people made it out to be, but Apple is under the microscope, and enough people started talking about this terrible issue that it was something Apple had to address. Steve didn't help matters himself because, when he answered a customer's email, it would often get circulated around the internet. Oh, I got an email from Steve Jobs. Well, somebody wrote him a note within 24 hours of the iPhone 4 coming out saying, Steve, when I hold the phone like this, I'm dropping my calls. This is terrible. So Steve's reply was, don't hold it that way. So that didn't do Apple any favors. So it got to the point where Steve had to have a press conference just to talk about this one problem, which had never happened before and never happened after. But while I was listening to this, to what he was saying at the press conference, I realized he was very heavily playing the love card. So I took that 1 hour and I cut it down to 45 seconds, and I share it with you now. Just one note of explanation. I think you know this. I don't know how America-centric anyone might be. But when we have a scandal back home, we always stick the word gate at the end of it, thanks to Watergate and Richard Nixon. So this became known as the Antenna-Gate scandal.
I love you so much.
We want to make all of our users happy. We love making our users happy. We make all our users happy. We care about every user. We want every user to be happy. We care about every user. What motivates us is to just have them love them. So we love our users. We love our users so much. We do all this because we love our users. We love our customers. We love our users. We really love them.
I love you so much. It hurts.
So a lot of people don't realize this, but that was the way Steve always did things. Even at his new product introductions, he would distill his message to normally a single sentence, and then he would proceed to beat it to death during the whole presentation, and people would go away sort of playing it back. He was very good at that kind of a thing. Antenna-Gate blew over rather quickly because Steve's customers did have that emotional connection to Apple. And when Steve explained it all, and it all kind of went away, and Apple did just as well as if nothing had ever happened. I think a lot of companies have issues, like maybe an exploding battery issue. I don't know, things happen. And who knows how long it will take them to recover from that. But it depends on how much love the Samsung customers are feeling. Words are very important. I'm a writer, so that's how I got in with Apple was, by the way, words got handled. And Apple was the company I always wanted to work for because they were so human. And I thought it was such a cool way to talk about technology. So, but before we can even talk about words, let's talk about letters, because this is my big moment, my lifetime achievement. Yeah, I wrote that letter. And it's kind of embarrassing, a little humbling, because I am a writer and I've written much longer things than this. But this is the thing that people tend to remember, so I just milk it every chance I get. And I'm not going to have too many more chances because the I is going away. It's obviously being sent off into the sunset with Apple Pay, Apple Music, Apple Watch. I think Apple got tired of all the lawsuits and all the I things going around. It's a lot easier just to call things Apple Watch and Apple Music. So who knows how much longer the I will be with us. But like the iPad name and the iPhone, I bring you another bit for your, when you're out drinking with your buddies. Maybe you can win some money by, making bets or whatever, but I'm going to tell you where the I came from, because usually people are interested in that. But it started with the iMac, and then it turned into all these other I things and many more from Apple. But then that's when the problem started, is that companies all around the world started doing I things, and I think that sort of confused things in the end. But this is my favorite. I found this in Copenhagen. And amusing as it may be, it actually captures the reason for the I. Let's take this in logical order. Steve had this issue. We have this new computer. In a day when computers were beige and boxy and boring, we had this thing that didn't look like anything anybody had ever done before. Translucent blue. You could see the circuitry inside through the plastic. And this was the first computer Apple would make after Steve's return. It had to be just amazing, every detail. So we need a name for it. And Steve had a name in his mind that he was very, very happy with, shockingly. And it was this, Mac Man. That's what he wanted to call it. And when he revealed that to us, we all made a collective gasp, like, you can't do that. It's like, sure I can. I like this name. And we had a whole debate about it, and he said, well, I'm telling you because you have a chance to do better, if you can do better. Otherwise, I'm happy with Mac Man, because it sounded a little like Sony. And at that time, Apple was just a computer company, not an electronics company. And he thought Sony at the time was with Walkman, he thought that was a direction Apple might want to go one day. So we came back in a week. iMac was actually one of the first names I came up with, because the concept of the computer was easy way to the internet. In those days, it wasn't easy. You'd have to buy a computer and then a modem and then plug it in and find someplace, dial into someplace and go through a configuration thing. It was not something that normal people did. So iMac automated all that. You plugged it in, it would come on and say, do you want an internet account? You fill out the form, and you're done. So I brought back iMac and 4 other names, and he hated every one of them. Came back a week later with 3 new names, plus iMac, because we still believed in that, and he hated them all again. And then a couple days later, this is the way things happen in the Apple world sometime. A person inside Apple told me that Steve had the name stenciled on a model. He was showing it around, getting good reactions from people, and suddenly that was just it, iMac. And I think in later weeks or months, I found out that one of the things Steve loved about it, and this is an interesting insight to his personality, was it was a visual thing. He liked the fact that it was just 4 characters, the small I and the capital M. He just liked the way it looked on the machine. So for him, it was not just a name for the product, but it was part of the whole visual experience. And that's obviously something that, it's not new news about Steve when you see where Apple went from there, but he was always thinking that way. Anyway, so it wouldn't have been iMac if we didn't persevere, if we didn't keep bringing it back even after he killed it. So it's something I'm very proud of, because had we not done that, you could well be sitting there today with your phone mans, and that would be rather awkward. I do wonder where Apple would have gone if there was no I, but we don't have to worry about that now. So it became iMac, and the beauty of the Think Different campaign, to show you how this all fits together, is that when Steve gave us the assignment to do a brand campaign, we had no idea what computers were going to look like 6 months away when the iMac came out. All we knew is that Steve said they're going to be really outrageous and cool, but we didn't know what that even meant, because who'd ever seen a computer that looks like this? So we seeded the world with Think Different for a good 6 to 8 months before iMac came out. And really all we had to do at that point, because we really drove home the idea that Apple thinks different, we really only needed to put a photo of the computer on a page and say, think different. And it was pretty obvious that Apple was thinking different. And that was true of every product that we came out with after that point. Things always looked very different, and they gave people a capability that improved their life or work. So think different. I wish I could say we totally, purposefully did it that way, but it worked out that way, where this pure brand campaign about Apple thinking different, where you never saw a piece of technology in the commercial or the billboards or anything, those things that we did. But when the product started coming out, the product ads paid off the brand idea of think different. So we stopped doing brand ideas, but the product ads became brand ads, because they added yet another dimension to the idea of thinking different. So that was pretty fortunate. Speaking of product names, we talked about the 41 different laptop models that HP makes. They give them all these names. None of them really relate to the company name. They don't relate to each other. So whenever they come out with a new product, they have to basically start from scratch, building an identity for it and teaching people what it means, what it stands for. So HP, I'm doing this research and I'm looking, and I see HP ZBook, HP Envy, HP Split, and I get to this one computer that's called HP, and I'm like, forget a word there or something? It's like, no, that really is the name of the computer, and I can't explain it, but I'm just here to report the facts. I also think it's not a particularly good idea, if you're going to name a product, to name it after a classic horror film like The Omen, but they did. If you look over at Asus, this is one of my new favorites. They changed their site a lot, so this was a few months ago, probably not what you see today, but it was just a few months ago. These were the names of the 6 computers they featured on their homepage. This is exactly the way they presented them, complete with the capitalizations. So some of them are upper and lowercase, some of them are all uppercase, not exactly consistent. I don't know what the reasoning is. But the lesson here, I think, is that human beings like to refer to things by names. It's not like, again, it's not brain surgery. I tell people I love my iPhone. What's it called again? I love my iPhone. I have friends who say I love my Galaxy, but I don't think any of us should be holding our breath waiting for anyone to ever say, I really love my Asus ROG G370JW. It's common sense, and it's surprising how many companies don't learn this lesson. You can see the success of these products in the world, and yet these things keep happening. So someone once asked me, so the world is getting simpler, and when everyone is making simple products, or everyone believes in the power of simplicity, then simplicity won't be a differentiator anymore. Well, I think Asus is a good example of the fact that we won't have to worry about that anytime soon. I think as long as human beings exercise certain of these, ways of working, people who believe in the power of simplicity will always stand out, because there will always be a ton of companies that don't think about things that are pretty darn obvious. Over at Apple, they only have 3 kinds of computers. They have a MacBook Air, they're all MacBooks. They have a MacBook Air, which is thin and light. They have a MacBook, which is thinner and lighter, so they need to do something about that. And now the new MacBook Pro, which actually in certain models is lighter than the MacBook Air. But there's some major work to do there, actually. But Air means light, and Pro means Pro. And every computer, every laptop Apple makes is a MacBook of some sort. Every phone Apple makes is an iPhone. They don't confuse people that way, and they try to just always take advantage of the fact that human beings like to refer to things by their names, and their name should give you some indication of what it is that the thing does. Fewer things, doing fewer things better. This has been a part of Apple for a very, very long time. When I was doing this new book, I interviewed Ron Johnson, who is someone I knew from my days at Apple. He's the guy who created the Apple stores. He started from zero Apple stores, and for 11 years built the network up to 350 Apple stores. And he tells the story of the very beginning days when it was just a concept, and they were sitting around a small table. And Ron said to Steve, well, how many products are we going to be selling in the store? We need to know some of the basic requirements here. And Steve said, well, if you look at every product Apple makes, they'd all fit on this table. So it's like, oh, I guess we don't need a really big store then, do we? But then they started talking about the value of the space itself and what that makes a customer feel and how we would set it up for home use and pro use and all that kind of thing. And they ended up where they ended up. But the point is that Apple doesn't make a lot of things. You can look at its competitors, and they offer just a ton more. Some people complain today that Apple is starting to make too many things. They don't make nearly as many as a lot of their competitors do. So Steve had, Steve famously said that innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. It's the ability to not do things you could do just so you keep things clear and distinct and not mislead or distract people with a lot of other things that are just going to prevent them from enjoying something to its max. When Steve came back to the company in 1990, well, he came back in 1997, but in 1998, when he introduced the iMac, Apple was making more than 20 distinct products, not just laptops and desktops, but they were making phones and cameras and printers and scanners and Newtons and all these things that were the reason why Apple was going bankrupt, actually. Because each of these products required R&D and marketing, and Apple wasn't selling a lot. So that's why the company was in trouble. So what Steve did when he had introduced the iMac was something that I don't think any company has ever done. He basically said, I'm killing every product we make except for two. So that day he said he's going to make four things only: a home and a pro version of a laptop and a desktop. That was the grid he was going to fill in. So that day he was introducing the iMac. There was an existing Power Mac for the pros, the Tower model. There was an existing PowerBook, which was the laptop for the pro user. But then Steve, who was the master of simplicity, who built Apple, he created this whole Apple renaissance by being so secretive and using, the power of buzz to amplify the importance of every launch they did. He stood there on stage that day and said, the next thing you're going to see from us is the home version of a laptop. There was no secret at all. And some 4 or 6 months later, I forget how long it was, but sure enough, then the iBook came along. There was no secret to it. But what this did, just like Brian Hartzer with making things easier for the people who sold credit cards in his bank, this made it totally easy for everyone to understand what Apple stood for. Instead of just being a company that makes mediocre products just to have a presence in every category, Apple was going to make only world-leading products in 4 categories only. And all their R&D and marketing money was going to go into these 4 products only. And every Apple employee knew what the company stood for. Every Apple customer knew what the company stood for. So it clarified things for everybody. Another important point is the idea of minimizing. Obviously, it's one of the essences of simplification. For this, we turned to Apple University, which is something Steve started quite some time ago, but the idea is that every incoming executive at Apple should understand what makes Apple Apple. What are their values? Why did they decide to do certain things at different points in the company's history? So they look at case studies like when the iPhone came out, it didn't even have apps. Steve wouldn't allow it to have apps, and then they thought about that a little bit more. Okay, let's allow developers to make apps, and now apps are the single biggest moneymaker inside Apple, practically. So that and the decision to bring iTunes to the Windows, there was a while where iTunes would be only available to Mac users because those were our customers, and we don't want to, share this with the PC people. But if they see how cool this software is, then maybe they'll want to buy a Mac. And they have all those things that go back and forth. So that's what they talk about at Apple U, and they use this as a visual aid. It's a series of 12 water drawings by Picasso that he did over this period of 12 days. You only see 11 of them here, only because I couldn't fit. But you get the idea. Picasso started with this very detailed illustration of a bull. And then he went through a little arty phase there in the middle, but he ended up with the most sparse group of lines that are aesthetically very pleasing. There's almost no detail there whatsoever, but guess what? It says bull just as clearly as the more detailed illustration does. So that's the lesson they teach, that you don't have to present every detail to get your point across. In fact, you're doing yourself a disservice because people will be more attracted to what you say if you make it nicer to look at and you distill it down so that they can understand your point without all the distractions. That's the art of minimization. This is a quote from Steve that sums all that up, that we make progress by eliminating things, by removing the superfluous. And I think that's a pretty good description of how Apple has approached all of its products, really, trying to make them do amazing things, but stripping away the things that just don't need to be there. Apple has always been very good at minimizing the words. And as they do so, they humanize the words. They don't, when they introduced the first iPod, which looks pretty funny by today's standards, but it had 3 features that really set it apart from all the other music players out there. It had a 5 gigabyte drive, which was huge. It had a FireWire port for fast transfer to your computer, and it had this amazing new click wheel interface, none of which they mentioned in any of their advertising. That stuff was all there on the website if you wanted to go explore why it was a good thing. But to the world, in all their advertising, all they said was 1,000 songs in your pocket, which was revolutionary because music players at that time, there were a ton of them, but they really didn't hold more than 1 or 2 CDs worth of music. And I remember it with some degree of pain because literally 1 week before this came out, I bought a brand new music player that held 2 CDs. And I had to throw it away because I had to line up with all the other Apple fans to get my new iPod. But the idea of 1,000 songs in your pocket, it's so human. There's no technology there whatsoever. It's an idea that you can do something that you could never have done before, and it's going to be really, really fun for you. And that's what they did. And iPod and iTunes became a huge revolution, really changed what Apple was all about. This one is about believing. And I was searching for a good word to use, but Steve was very much against focus groups. He had this confidence that what he was doing was right based on his instinct. And his instinct was based on his experience as a customer. His entire life, he was buying things. He knew what drove customers. And he believed in the conclusions he drew about such things. So there's this video of him which is related in a certain way. I'll have to explain this, but this is Steve giving an interview. It's just one of my favorites, where he's asked to talk about Microsoft, and he gives his opinion about Microsoft. There's a long pause in here, so I'm not trying to bore you, but there's a point to be made by that also. So bear with me and just take a look at this for one moment.
The only problem with Microsoft is they just have no taste. They have absolutely no taste. And what that means is, I don't mean that in a small way, I mean that in a big way. In the sense that they don't think of original ideas, and they don't bring much culture into their product.
So a couple of things about that. Just one, because everybody always asks what it was like to work with Steve. And of all the videos I've seen of him, this one captures something that is like so much him and nobody ever talks about. But that long pause that he gives in there, he was extremely good at thinking before he speaks. We all saw that in him all the time. He really, and it happened not only on stage, but it happened in small meetings as well. He was really concerned about articulating in the clearest possible way. And this video just reminds me of that. You could see the wheels spinning in his head, like, how am I going to put this so you're going to remember it? It's just kind of one of the remarkable things about the man, I think, that he really gave thought to what he said, and he was a smart person, and he was incredibly good at articulating things. But back to the topic. He said that his problem with Microsoft, and by the way, that's another one of my favorite things, that he said Microsoft has no taste. I don't mean that in a small way, I mean that in a really big way. I'm sorry, you may be Microsoft fans, but I thought that was an amusing way to put things, because he was proud of the level of taste and quality they would put into their products. But he mentioned that it's about bringing culture into the products. And this is one of those things in writing this new book, talking to these leaders all around the world about the importance of simplicity and about the importance of making that part of the culture. And that when your culture embraces this, that's how people work. That colors everything they do. And when it comes to designing products even, it comes out in the products. And I think Steve's point that Apple's culture shows up in their products is an extremely important one. And I think I would tend to agree that knowing people who've worked with Microsoft, that it's not as deep in their culture well, what their culture is a little ambiguous, I think, and their products somewhat reflect that. Certainly not in as pure a way as Apple's products reflect its culture. So another place around the world, in South Korea, I found this company called Hyundai Card, which is part of the Hyundai Motor Group, and the vice chairman there, Ted Chung, is a really amazing guy. But Hyundai Card, when he joined 10 years before, they were projected to lose $2 billion in a single year. And he took that job undaunted and proceeded to turn it around to the point where it now makes a profit of $1 billion a year. So from minus $2 billion to plus $1 billion in 10 years. And he talks about how he changed the culture of this company, and he gave it a focus that made everything simpler. For them, interestingly, it was design. You wouldn't think that a credit card company would be so big on design, but everything they do is about design, even the way their cards look, but the work environment, the kinds of furniture they have there, the things they do for the community. They do free work in designing things. They design bus shelters. And they sort of embrace this lifestyle with a love of design, and their product is associated with that because they live that inside the company. But this whole thrust about focus, about building a strong culture, has totally changed Hyundai Card, and it's all about the culture, the value of simplicity, focus, and the power of design. Bottom line is that being simple isn't. I think the reason Steve Jobs was so good at what he did is that he sort of embraced both ends of the equation. He was a champion of simple ideas, but he was this brutal foe of complexity. And I would argue that a lot of the stories you hear about how tough he could be really were those moments were his response to things getting too complicated or someone losing their focus. And he didn't have a lot of patience for things like that, and the eruptions would then occur. But for him, simplicity was this lens through which he looked at absolutely everything. And it wasn't just the products, like I say, it was the advertising and the design of the Apple Store and how customer service was done. You could almost see, you know, those moments of this wheel spinning in his head again, where he was just trying to figure out whether the message was clear and memorable, and was the thing we're saying important enough to be a focus. He was almost maniacal in that way that, you know, when you presented to him, you had to be very buttoned up about what it is we're trying to do, and this is the most powerful way to do that. My favorite quote from him is this one: "Simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple, but it's worth it in the end, because once you get there, you can move mountains." And I hear, you know, pithy sayings all the time, and if I just heard this one, I would probably say thank you very much and move on. But when you think that this is Steve Jobs' philosophy, this is the way he summed it up, and that this was the philosophy by which he turned a company that was near death into the most valuable company on earth in 14 years, probably worth, you know, giving a little thought to. But that isn't to say he couldn't have said it simpler, so I went to work on it for him and came up with that one. His version is a little bit more eloquent than mine, though, so I stick with his. Oh yeah, so this is kind of the end, but not really. It's my trick ending, and you fell for it. I noticed a little smile, a couple of you smiled at some point, and now you will pay the price. I have a little kind of amusing ending for you. At least I think it's amusing. You be the judge. But I have a site called Scoopertino that I do with my former Apple design partner. I used to ask if anyone's heard of Scoopertino, but rarely does anyone raise their hand, so I stopped. But basically, we specialize in Apple-based humor, which you may think is a rather small target. However, we've had over 5 million viewers in the last few years, so someone's coming, even if it's nobody in this room. But what we do is we make fun. Well, first of all, we don't make any money doing this, so I don't want you to think I'm trying to sell you anything. We have like a tiny little Google ad, and we make like $5 a month. But we have fun with the negative things people say about Apple. Usually, people say Apple, you know, the critics, Apple's trying to, you know, control the world. They just want your money. They don't really invent anything. It's just copying other people's products. We don't believe that, but we like to have some fun with it. So we make up these stories, and we play off of the latest news sometimes, or we make up products or whatever. So I'm just going to share 2 of them with you to, you know, just give you a little chuckle. So the first one, I mentioned the thing about the iPhone 4 and its terrible antenna, you know, shorting out if you held it. Well, it wasn't Apple's fault. It was you and your fleshy fingers. You held the phone and you shorted it out. So we came up with a new product called the iHand. And the iHand was a wooden hand that you would hold in your hand, and it would eliminate the whole problem. We think of every little detail, too. You'll notice the little telescoping rod in the wrist there. Well, you could hold it at a comfortable distance to your ear, or if you choose, you could hold it to the ear of a colleague. Your choice. And then we came up with a fake product called Apple Water. And this, by the way, was years ahead of its time because they were still into the eye things then. I have no idea why we didn't call it iWater, but we went with Apple Water because we were so, you know, amazing. Clean, simple, wet, Apple Water. What would it be like if Apple created water? So we sort of explored that a little bit. You'll notice that there's well, you can't read it, but I'll read it to you. The second caption there on the bottle on the left side, it says molecular perfection, literally twice as many hydrogen atoms as there are oxygen atoms, right? Only from Apple. We came up with an ad for Apple Water. If you're an Apple fan, you've got Apple on the outside. Now you can have it on the inside. And we came up with a new fake product to go with our first fake product, and we called it Apple Water Pro. There you go. For the power user. Anyway, that's Scoopertino, by the way, in case you couldn't figure it out. Apple is based in Cupertino. Scoopertino is kind of a news story from Cupertino. Okay. I'm not sure if that works in Spanish. This is the other half of my Spanish vocabulary, the first half being hola. So that actually is it. No more fake endings. So I want to thank the EAE Business School for inviting me, because I have never been in Barcelona. And I've had a really amazing time. I just got here yesterday, and I'm leaving tomorrow. But I've just been walking all around, and it's an amazingly beautiful city, as I heard it was. So I look forward to coming back sometime, but I really appreciate the invitation. And everybody has been so amazingly good to me. So hopefully, I'm going to study my Spanish, and when I come back, maybe we can have a deeper conversation. So thank you. Am I supposed to sit? Okay. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Ken. Why all you guys at Apple dress in black? It's kind of scary.
Say it again.
Why all you guys at Apple dress in black?
I don't know. It's just part of the code. You know.
Regarding what you explained about naming, have you ever considered a career in pharma? I think it would be like very useful there, in pharmaceutical.
Oh yeah.
So we have, I really like tricky questions. So we have today some top employees from very smart companies. BlaBlaCar, Booking, Spotify, and MyTaxi. So I would like to make some kind of diagnosis about simplicity in their design. Let's talk about, for instance, websites, apps.
Rephrase that last part. So I'm sorry.
Refer to BlaBlaCar, Booking, Spotify, MyTaxi.
Okay.
We have today like 4
Right.
top employees from these companies here. So, do you think that simplicity can be linked to their performance?
The design of the
Yeah,
website, you're
design.
saying? Yes, absolutely. And I think I have to admit that the world has gotten like much better. And just being an Apple kind of person, I attribute part of that to Apple and its big success, and people start copying a lot of things. I wouldn't say it's all due to Apple, but I think there is a greater sense of the value of simplicity in the design of sites. And there are a lot of really good ones today, and I think that does draw people in. One of the people I interviewed in this new book is a design firm in London, and they had an interesting scientific basis for all this, which was that I wish I could remember his name. There's a Hungarian psychologist, I think, or professor, very long, difficult name to pronounce, but he talks about the importance of flow, and maybe you're familiar with this, but when you're in a state of flow on a website, you're not distracted by the flashing lights on the left or the right. Your mind sort of goes into the flow, and you're happy to be there. You don't want to leave, and you sort of follow a path. And that's what they've based their whole business on, and they do very well. They do work for some very big companies, and they're all about creating this sense of flow, which is, I think, it creates. It is a form of simplicity. It's you're following a path, and you're not being distracted by complexity.
We talked about mostly material simplicity, but let's move towards moral simplicity. Do you think that the simplicity can be conveyed to managing skills, managing forums?
I do.
How?
I thought maybe we could just drop it there. No, I think that's a very big part of it. I think the great thing about simplicity, if you're going to talk about it, is it isn't any one thing. It could be a product, it could be a design, it could be a website or internal organization. But yeah, it's absolutely in a manager's mind as well. It's how you present projects to the people who are doing the work, and the way you react to them, and there are just countless ways. It has to do really in a way of putting your employees in a state of flow, that they kind of know what they need to do, and they're not distracted by questions, like what did he mean by this? They're not clear enough. Steve Jobs was amazingly clear in his directions. So we knew where we stood and we knew what we had to do. I didn't work directly for him, but he was my client for most of the time. And he was a very good communicator. So, and part of that was being a straight shooter, so as they would say. There was no half-truths, and he wasn't trying to manipulate you into doing something. It was a lot of honesty. This is the issue. This is what you got to do. Here's the product. We need to do this, and we need to do it fast. Whatever it was. But then you knew, okay, I'm going to be up for a couple of consecutive nights, and I need to do this thing by Friday, whatever. But there's clarity, focus. When I talked to all these guys around the world, that was the essence of it all was always focus, people knowing exactly what the mission is, having a strong mission in the company, having clear values to guide people as they make decisions and about the ways they behave. It's all about clarity.
Today we're talking about the smart companies. We're talking lately about the smart companies, smart cities, smart everything. What do you think about this smart?
The smart
thing
word?
Before everything.
He's asking very tough questions. I've never heard these before. To be honest, I haven't had a negative reaction. I haven't seen it used too much yet, personally, other than smartphones and things like that. And I see like the smart card in the airport or something. I'm not aware of a gross overusage of the word, but it's been used enough. Like if I were naming a product, I would steer clear of it. I mean, it does seem, like well-traveled territory. So you're reminding me of a presentation I had to give inside Apple once to all the writers there. And one of the issues was, what do you do when every new product you make is the best one you've ever made? And if I were going to lay back and be a critic of Apple today, it's almost every phone that has come out, you go to the site, it'll say the fastest iPhone we've ever built or the best iPhone we've ever built. And I'm like, well, if it weren't, I think you'd be in big trouble. It's not the kind of thing that really needs to be said. But when you say those things, it actually, I think, diminishes you a bit. If you can't, the problem is there's only so many ways to say it. So a creative writer, I can understand if someone said, I'm sorry, I've been thinking about it for 3 solid weeks. There are no other ways. Then maybe you just sort of change the emphasis of what you say and where you put the fast comment. But in this last presentation, Tim Cook did that. This is the best iPhone we've ever built. And it's like, okay,
Thank you. I'm pretty sure some of you will be interested in making some question to Ken. But these lights are really lighting me, so I cannot see your hands up. Don't be shy.
Okay, well.
No?
I guess I was so
Yes?
clear that...
Oh, there.
Okay.
Have a hand there.
Hello, my name is Matilde Martinez Casanovas. I'm an ex-student from EA. Good afternoon, Mr. Ken. I have a simple question. We know that Steve Jobs was a genius, and Tim Cook has another style. But do you think that now Apple is losing his simplicity?
That last part, do I think Apple is losing simplicity? Is that
Yes.
the question?
In their bases?
In a certain sense, yes. I mean, I blog about this kind of thing all the time, so I'm trying to do the short version. But I think there are certain things Apple has done that sort of perplex me. I think if you zoom back and look at what they're doing versus what other companies do, they're still far less complicated. But one thing is that, the world changes so much. Like even just the 5 years since Steve passed away, the target audience is so much more sophisticated and has different needs. There have been some people who say, like, well, gee, now they have 3 different size iPhones. Like, well, you know, when Steve was around, they took one very popular iPod and suddenly had 3 models of iPod because there were different use factors. You know, there was, you know, someone who wants to go to the gym with a tiny one and someone wants, you know, a different kind. So I think there are people who want a small iPhone, some people want a big iPhone. To me, that kind of thing is not complexity. That's just responding to the market. Apple resisted making a large iPhone for way too many years, and Samsung was just starting to eat their market share. And I'm sure that's what they talked about inside Apple. It's like, well, are we going to stick to our guns here and go down with this whole idea that we have the perfect size phone, or are we going to give the people who want a larger phone a larger phone? So they, you know, they did it, and sales rocketed when they did that, and now they're doing the small one for, you know, a cheaper price of admission. So things like that don't bother me, but certain things like about the naming, I've never been a fan of the S naming for iPhones. I think that's very self-destructive. It sort of has taught the world that they only innovate every other year. I don't know why they'd want people to think that, but I think by naming their phones that way, they've inadvertently done that at a time when the competition is very, very red hot. I don't think that serves them well. And, you know, marketing, I don't love some of the recent ads, but then once in a while they do one that I really, really do love. So it's different. It can't be the same without Steve Jobs. You know, you have different people making decisions, and different people have different levels of taste. So I think that's what we see. And hopefully, you know, my feeling is as long as the values remain, Apple would be in good shape. But nothing is forever. You never know.
And your question? Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
You mentioned that it's your first visit in Barcelona. So what kind of simplicity have you found in Barcelona that you haven't found in other cities?
I found one bit of complexity. I'd like to complain about it publicly.
Oh, that was not my question. My question was simplicity.
It seems to be built in, too. It's funny. Someone asked me the question in London recently, and I unloaded on them as well. But it took me a while to kind of understand. Maybe it's not everywhere, but when you're walking, and I was doing a lot of walking yesterday, and you get to an intersection, like where I come from, you just kind of keep walking in a straight line, and then suddenly I have to go this way, and then across the street, and then that way. It's like, why? Why is that? Do you know?
I think it's so your Fitbit register more steps, or you can just look all the business around the corner. But you get used to it, believe me.
Okay.
Maybe in your second visit you'll enjoy it most.
It was interesting. But as far as, you know, I mean, really, my experience here has just been as a walker, and I went to I keep forgetting the name. How do I say it again? Sagrada Familia?
Yes, rather familiar.
Not exactly an example of simplicity.
Not my question again.
Yeah, that's the fun part when you're into this thing and you go, okay, I talk about simplicity, the power of simplicity, and then I proceed to denigrate the world's greatest buildings, you know. So I don't mean to do that. And it was quite amazing, actually. I had a great time there. But no, I mean, again, my experience, I haven't, you know, had anything but good experiences here. So you have a city to be proud of. Very beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes, 2. Well, a lot of questions now.
Hi. We were earlier talking about simplicity and about brand names. I was wondering if you think that Apple, the brand Apple, over time can maintain its simplicity on a brand level, because there are rumors they're making a car, you have the Apple Watch, and they seem to move to other spaces beyond like what we always knew as laptops, iPhones, iPads, etc. So the things like a car and probably other kind of things. Do we get to the point when they're like Google have to create like a new company, like Alphabet or something, split up to maintain the Apple brand pure? And I think, for example, the same thing with Philips, something totally different. But there's so many products and so many kind of areas you're working in. Do you think to maintain over time the simplicity Apple has, you come to the point you might split up the company at some point?
I don't know. You know, I always use Walt Disney Company as an example, and when Walt was there, it was so different. And then following his death, they went through a period of uncertainty, and then they started buying media companies, ABC and ESPN, and putting parks in all kinds of different countries around the world. And I think if you look at Disney today, it's just a totally different company than it was when Walt was there. And I assume the same thing is going to happen with Apple. And I think the issue with Apple is that it is so distinct, and people who love it for what it is, that it's very difficult for people to accept that it's going to change. But I mean, I think 20 years from now, we'll look back at what it is today, and it'll almost be hard to recognize because opportunities will come up. Who knows what kind of companies Apple might buy or what kind of products they might come up with. It also, every time I show that grid about the 4 products, Apple's going to kill all of its products and make 4 things only. Well, when we came out with the Power Mac Cube, a failed product, but Steve put that grid up there, and then the top 2 squares went whoop, like that, and then another square dropped down, and that's where that product went. Well, if you look at that grid today, there's iPods and iPads and iPhone, and that grid is not so simple anymore. But I think it's all because Apple is similar to Google in that it exists to do really interesting things, and there will always be new ones. And I think the product offering will always get bigger, whether it gets so big that at some point they might want to spin off one brand. Who knows, really? I think it's got a long way to go before it does something like that, though. Just my opinion.
Another question?
Hello, Mr. Segall. Just a short question. I'm sorry.
We cannot see you.
When you have found a new idea, especially a different idea, a creative idea, how to sell in the inside of the company, and what's the role of selling the idea?
What's that last thing? What's the role of what?
Of selling the idea.
Okay. So let me see if I got that straight. So it's about selling a product inside a company, how you would go about that? Is that what the question is?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I do think there's a danger in just saying this is how it should work everywhere, because I think every company is different. So it depends on what kind of company you're talking about. But I've always thought that I've known in my advertising life so many great creative people who got frustrated and ultimately quit and got out of the business because they didn't know how to sell an idea, and they got very, very frustrated when all their work kept getting rejected. So I think every business is at the end of the day a people business, and you do need to understand, what's driving the people that you're interacting with, and how to, not come off like a jerk, and how to get them on your side. And it's the same thing dealing with a client outside the company. I actually built a reputation for myself. I almost wish I didn't, but for being able to work with difficult clients. So anytime somebody had a problem, they would put me on the job, because I had this ability to go out to dinner with them and make them suddenly start liking us again. So they put a dollar value on sending me out to dinner, I guess. But it might have been that actually led to me working with Steve Jobs too, so I can't really knock that. But I think it's always about human relationships, and as much as it may be about business, you can't just expect your ideas to sell themselves, and you have to understand your audience and operate accordingly. So it's kind of a fuzzy answer, but I think that's the best I can do.
Okay, one last more question.
Ooh,
Because we have to finish.
way the hell
We'll have
back
for
there.
everything. So, who was the first? You were first? Okay, you have to.
Hi. One question. Would you say that Apple has taken simplicity way too far by removing the USB ports, the headphone plugs on all their devices, and everything now?
I shouldn't confess this, but in the spirit of honesty, the day they announced that the new MacBooks, I think I was coming back from Madrid,
I have
actually.
one.
You
It
got
doesn't
one?
have anything. Like, it doesn't come with a USB or...
You got the new one?
Yeah, the new one.
But not with the touch bar?
None.
Okay. I ordered one, and then I ordered the adapters, and then I started thinking, after 2 weeks, well, all I really use my laptop for is going around making these presentations, and I don't want to have all those adapters with me. So I actually canceled that order, and I ordered the 13-inch MacBook Air because it's kind of what I already have, except I have the little 11-incher. So I can't believe I did that because I wanted that cool new touch bar, and I thought it was, a really, really good machine. That doesn't answer your question. Did they go too far? I don't think so. Phil Schiller, who's the Apple product guy who speaks at a lot of these events, he got some ridicule for talking about Apple. I forget what move he was talking about, but he explained it away by saying Apple had courage, and that back in the old days when the iMac came out, it had no floppy drive, and that created a firestorm of people saying, how can you possibly have a computer without a floppy drive? You've got to get your files in and out. Well, Steve Jobs had said, obviously things are going to be done over the internet. We don't need to carry these stupid things around with us. And Phil told the story about a friend who worked at a different computer company who called him and said, I cannot believe how lucky you are to work at a company that would do something like that, because we could never, ever do that. Our customers would just abandon us. But Apple has this ability to take risks like that to move everybody along. And then within a year, nobody had floppy drives. So I think there is always a painful transition period. But for myself, I decided, you know what, I think I'll just wait. And when I get my next one, maybe a couple of years from now, obviously all the peripherals I want are going to have that port, and I can not have to worry about carrying dongles. So yes and no, in answer to your question. I think clearly the vision is there that most things we do will be wireless, and then if everything else used the same kind of port, then that actually does make things simpler. We're just at this point now where not enough of those things exist, so we have to use these adapters. But again, Apple has this courage to do something that I don't think other companies would do. And you could argue that it's going to hurt, they're going to hurt themselves by doing this, but they keep doing it, and they keep pushing everyone else forward by doing it. So I'm imagining that in the future, everything works that way, and then people say, well, Apple is the one who kind of moved us along. But someone has to do it, I guess, and Apple sort of accepts that role.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken. Thank you for coming.
Okay. Thank you. And
let's have some coffee. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Please. And I'm going to, I'll be floating around afterwards. We can chat privately.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.